the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. On behalf of ICS, I welcome you all to the ICS Wednesday seminar. We have an extremely timely discussion today as we mark 2 years of crisis in eastern Ladakh. On 5th May 2020, the first clash occurred across the line of actual control in Ladakh between India and China, resulting in injuries to several soldiers on both sides. This was followed by another clash on the nights of 15-16 June 2020, resulting in 20 Indian and 4 PLA soldiers killed in action. While the Chinese view on the current situation are ambiguous, or rather, China has iterated that the border issue should not define the overall developments of bilateral relations. The Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has clearly stated post the visit of Wang Yi that India's relationship with China is not normal, given the presence of a large number of troops in contravention of the 1993-96 agreements. Despite several rounds of talks at national, diplomatic, and military levels, over the past 2 years, the current crisis shows no sign of resolution. Existing confidence-building mechanisms have neither been able to prevent nor aid in resolving the current crisis. Therefore, today's discussion is not only timely, but essential for the understanding the underlying causes of the crisis, developments over the past 2 years, the Chinese perspective, and the way ahead. We have with us, we have been joined by a distinguished panel today that needs no introduction. However, joining us today in the panel are Ambassador Gautam Bambawala, Distinguished Professor, Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, Symbiosis International University, Pune, Lieutenant General D.S. Huda, retired, PVSM, UYSM, AVSM, VSM, former Northern Army Commander, co-founder of the Council for Strategic and Defense Research, New Delhi, and a senior fellow at the Delhi Policy Group. Our third speaker is Senior Colonel Cho Ho, Senior Fellow of Center for International Security and Strategy, Tsinghua University, and Supervisor to Foreign Postgraduate Officers at PLA National Defense University. Our last speaker is Mr. Sushant Singh, Senior Fellow at Center for Policy Research and co-founder of the Indian Cable. The discussant for the panel is Dr. Rityusha Mane Tiwari, Department of Political Science, Shaheed Bhagat Singh College, University of Delhi, and is a visiting fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Chairing the discussion today this afternoon is Ambassador Ashok K. Kanta. He is Director, Institute of Chinese Studies, a career diplomat. He was Ambassador of India to China until January 2016. Before I hand over to the chair, let me lay out the housekeeping rules. We request the participants to remain muted until called to do so by the chair. To pose questions during the event, you may send in your queries, comments via the chat box or use the raise hand option during the Q&A. I invite the chair, Ambassador Ashok Kanta, Director ICS, to begin the proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Surabhi. Thanks for introducing our distinguished panel and also introducing the very important topic we have for discussion today. You know, as Surabhi mentioned, we have gathered to discuss 2 years of border crisis in eastern Ladakh. And we have, as she mentioned, extremely distinguished panel to help understand this important subject. Surabhi referred to the clashes which occurred on 5th May 2020 and then subsequently in the Galvan Valley on the night of 15-16 June 2020, which resulted in a large number of casualties on both sides. Beginning April 2020, there has been what the outgoing Army Chief General M.M. Narawane recently described as a paradigm shift in force posturing in eastern Ladakh. The Chinese People's Liberation Army today has a deployment of approximately 60,000 troops opposite eastern Ladakh from the erstwhile pre-crisis deployment of approximately 8,000 troops. And this enhanced deployment has been sustained over the last 2 years, including through winter months. There has been a corresponding build-up on the Indian side. There have been several rounds of talks, as Subi mentioned, at the political level, as well as through military and diplomatic channels. While there has been some limited progress through disengagement of troops at some friction points, close proximity situations persist at other locations. And there has been no de-escalation of troops. As I mentioned earlier, there is a very high level of troop deployment on both sides over the last 2 years. The current situation remains highly abnormal. The abnormalcy and the deficit of peace and tranquility in the border areas have deeply impacted the overall relationship between India and China, which has seen a major downturn over the past 2 years. The Indian side, as Survi mentioned, has made it clear that there cannot be business as usual between India and China until there is restoration of peace and tranquility and normalcy in border areas. In today's panel discussion, we'll try to explore the underlying issues and factors which led to the emergence of the current border crisis 2 years ago. Why did the Chinese decide to amass troops along the LAC in the western sector in violation of provisions of various agreements concluded between the two countries? Why did we have a border clash resulting in deaths on both sides, which was unprecedented at least since 1975? We'll review the progress made in seeking resolution of the ongoing crisis and take stock of the outstanding issues. We'll also explore the way ahead, including in terms of new confidence-building measures that might be required. We'll discuss how the border issue has once again come to occupy a central position in India-China relations. Our 4 speakers will speak for about 10-12 minutes each, and the discussant, Dr. Ritusha Tiwari, will have about 8 minutes. We hope to keep enough time for discussions thereafter. Before I invite our first speaker to speak, let me put on record deep appreciation for the work done by my colleague, Colonel K.K. Venkatraman, Research Fellow of the ICS, who conceptualized and put together this important panel discussion. Let me now start with Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, former Indian ambassador to China, Bhutan, and Pakistan, distinguished professor, Symbiosis International University, Pune, an adjunct fellow with the Institute of Chinese Studies. Gautam will try to explore the underlying causes of the current crisis, which, as you know, follows a series of standoff situations in border areas. He will look at the reasons behind the amassing of abnormally high level of troops by China opposite eastern Ladakh. He will examine what led to the clashes, including the Galvan Valley, why the current crisis is qualitatively different from earlier standoff situations along the LAC. I've also requested Gautam to look at the impact of the border issue on India-China relations and his prognosis of where we go from here. Over to you, Gautam.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kant, and thank you, Institute of Chinese Studies, for inviting me for this very important discussion about 2 years of crisis in Eastern Ladakh. And I'm going to dive straight into it. And I'm afraid that our story has to begin in December 1988, which is when the then Prime Minister of India, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, visited China, visited Beijing, visited Shanghai, and had a very important set of meetings with the then Chinese leadership, which was led by Mr. Deng Xiaoping, but also others, including Premier Li Peng and so on. Now, this particular visit in December 1988 was the first time that an Indian Prime Minister was visiting China after a gap of close to 30 years. And therefore, that visit was absolutely important and seminal. What was important in that visit and in the discussions between the Chinese and Indian leadership was that they arrived at some kind of understanding about how the relationship could move ahead and could move forward. And the understanding that was arrived in December 1988 between the leaderships of India and China was that, on the one hand, the two governments, the two countries will continue to seek a resolution of the outstanding boundary question or the boundary issue, the boundary problem between the two countries. So they would continue to search for a boundary resolution. At the same time, they would also put into place measures and steps which would ensure that peace and tranquility reigned in the India-China border areas. That is, the India-China border would remain peaceful. And when these preconditions were met, or when these conditions were met, the rest of the relationship could move ahead, particularly in trade, commerce, science and technology exchanges, people-to-people exchanges, educational exchanges, cultural exchanges, etc. So this was the kind of understanding which was arrived at between the leaders of our two countries. That on the one hand, we have to attempt to resolve the boundary question. At the same time, we will ensure and put into place measures and steps which will ensure that peace is maintained in the India-China border areas. And then on the other hand, the rest of the relationship, particularly in trade, commerce, people-to-people exchanges, will move ahead. Now, I think this understanding was very clear to us on the Indian side. The Chinese side recently, especially after in the last 2 years, has been arguing that as far back as December 1988, the two countries decided to compartmentalize the boundary on the one hand and the rest of the relationship on the other. But I think that is understanding which we do not have on the Indian side. And we should be very clear that there is no compartmentalization of these two issues. It is not as if the boundary will have its own life and the rest of the relationship will have its own life. So I think there is a little bit of distinction between the way the two countries, the two governments are playing this question of what was the understanding between the two countries for taking the relationship forward that was reached in 1988. I think this was an important starting point for our discussion, and therefore I went into it in some length. Now, this particular template, if I may use the word, this modus vivendi, which was arrived at in December 1988, continued all the way till 2019. And the relationship between India and China galloped ahead. And one good indication of that was the size of bilateral trade, which increased from 1988, it was 250 million US dollars. By 2019, it had come close to 100 billion US dollars. It was 90 odd billion dollars. So this is one indication of how far and fast the India-China relationship had progressed. And I'm using only this one indicator. There are many other areas in which the relationship had moved forward. In the meantime, as we moved into the 21st century, there were pulls and pressures on this kind of template, which was arrived as far back as 1988, at the end of 1988. And there were pulls and pressures on that template or that kind of modus vivendi, which had been arrived at between the two governments. And we could see that this pressure was building in the sort of close proximity situations, as Ambassador Kant rightly described them, which happened in 2013 in Depsang, 2014 when President Xi Jinping was visiting India. There was a close proximity situation in Chumar. Then, of course, you had the incident in Bhutan in 2017 at Doklam. So you could see that the bilateral relationship and the template in which it was developing was under pressure. And the reasons for that are quite easy to understand, because between 1988 and say 2017 or 19, not only had India changed in a number of ways, China itself had also changed in a number of ways, and the rest of the world had changed in a number of ways. And the governments of India and China, realizing this, understanding that the template and the understanding between the two governments was now under pressure, both the governments decided that we would try to attempt to answer these questions which were raised by these pressures through what is called the informal summits between the leaders of India and China. So you had a series of two back-to-back informal summits between President Xi Jinping, General Secretary Xi Jinping on the one hand, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi on the other. You had the Wuhan summit in April of 2018. You had the Chennai or Mamallapuram summit of October 2019. And these informal summits was an attempt by the top leaders of both countries to arrive at a new kind of understanding, a new template, a new modus vivendi in which the relationship could move ahead and which could be used for a longer period of time. However, before any kind of understanding could be reached, and it is difficult in just two meetings to arrive at such a understanding, after the Mamallapuram or Chennai summit, we saw that the Chinese side decided that they would, in the summer of 2020, bring in large number of troops into eastern Ladakh. And this has been mentioned by Ambassador Ashok Kant earlier in this session. Now, by bringing in those large numbers of troops to the border areas, the Chinese side was violating all the agreements which the two countries had arrived between 1988 and 2019, which were aimed at ensuring peace on the border. Because the first paragraph or the first opening paragraph of most of these agreements, and there were 3, 4, 5 separate agreements, but all of you know that 1993, 1996 were the foundational ones. So by moving large numbers of troops to the border areas without notifying the other side was a violation of the first paragraph of those agreements, which were reached between the governments of the two countries, between the two countries over so many years. So that itself was a violation. And as we have seen, it led to the clashes at Galvan on the night of 15-16 June 2020, where a large number of soldiers on both sides lost their lives. Now, why, the big question which everyone asks is, why do you think the Chinese did this? Now, irrespective of every other thing, I believe that there are two reasons why the Chinese leadership decided to do this. One is a more tactical reason, and one is a more strategic reason. The tactical reason is because the Chinese wanted to have actual control of certain areas which they were claiming in their discussions on the boundary with India, and which they may not have controlled in April of 2020 or May of 2020. So the tactical reason was to have actual control over certain areas which they were claiming in their border talks or boundary talks with India. But what is more important than the tactical reason is the strategic reason. And the strategic reason, in my opinion, is very, very clear and is crystal clear to me, at least 2 years after the crisis erupted. And the strategic reason was that China wanted to show not just India, China wanted to show the rest of Asia, other countries in Asia, and China wanted to show countries across the globe that she was the super eminent power in Asia. She was the hegemon in Asia. And that other nation states, other countries must not only accept it, but also admit that China is the big power in Asia. Now, of course, as we know, India also moved matching numbers of troops. There were abnormally high number of troops over these past 2 years in Eastern Ladakh. Even today, as per the recent interview given by the Chief of Army Staff, the retiring Chief of Army Staff who just retired a couple of days ago, there are still about 60,000 Chinese troops and 60,000 Indian troops in that locale, in that part of the border. And that is not a good thing, because it could always go out of control, as it did on the night of 15-16 June 2020 in Galvan. So in my opinion, these are the two proximate reasons for China having moved these number of troops. What has been the impact on India-China relations? That is something which is very important. We can see that India-China relations, apart from some meetings between military commanders in the border areas, apart from certain meetings of diplomats who deal with the boundary on the two sides, apart from a few meetings between the foreign ministers of the two countries. And there have also been some interactions between the top leaders in multilateral settings, say for meetings of the SCO or BRICS over the last 2 years. The rest of the India-China relationship, especially in terms of exchanges, has come to a grinding halt. Bilateral trade has continued. There is no, we have not, both countries have not tried to reduce bilateral trade. And in fact, trade increased in 2021 because there has been a global rebound in imports and exports of all countries across the world. So it is not just India's trade with China, which has increased. India's trade with the United States has increased. India's trade with the UAE has increased. And similarly, China's trade with most countries across the globe has increased in 2021 as compared to previous years. So while trade has not been impacted, other exchanges have been impacted, including, of course, Indian students who are studying at Chinese universities are not able to go back to their studies physically for various reasons, including, of course, the continuing COVID crisis in different parts of the globe. So the bilateral relationship, as Ambassador Kantha has very rightly said, has deteriorated tremendously. And we can see that when there is no peace on the border, the rest of the relationship will indeed be negatively impacted. Now, how do we address what has happened? What do we have to do while moving ahead? I think it is very clear that as far as India is concerned, that mere words are not going to provide any kind of solace. There will have to be action. And that action, to me at least, as a retired ambassador of India to China, is very clear that China will have to restore the status quo ante as it existed before April 2020 in eastern Ladakh and in the India-China border areas. Those actions will prove and will be much louder than any words that any leader of China can say. And let me end by just saying that when Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited Delhi recently, and I am a complete votary for keeping diplomatic channels of communication open between the two countries. So I'm very happy that this kind of visit did take place. But he was trying to search out and he was trying to see if there was any give in the Indian position of linking peace on the border with the rest of the relationship. And I believe that he has been told very clearly in Delhi that there is no such give in India's position, that unless peace is restored in the India-China border areas, the rest of the India-China relationship will continue to deteriorate in the coming weeks, in the coming months, and perhaps even in the coming years. So Ambassador Kant, I will stop there and hand the floor back to you. I think I have covered the ground that I wanted to, and I look forward to any questions later on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gautam. You have succinctly and admirably responded to all the queries that we had posed to you. You very rightly brought out the salience of the understanding reached in December 1988, which predicated development of India-China relations on maintenance of peace and tranquility in border areas. You also outlined two proximate reasons for China amassing troops in eastern Ladakh in early 2020. You brought out the impact of abnormal situation in border areas on the trajectory of India-China relations. And you also pointed out what needs to be done to restore the relationship to a more even normal track. Thanks for that presentation, which has set the context for our discussions this afternoon. I will now turn to Sushant Singh, who's, as you know, a renowned journalist and author, and currently senior fellow with Center of Policy Research. Sushant has very closely monitored developments in border areas, as also between India and China, since the incidents of May, June 2020. He has been writing on talks that have taken place between two countries through political, diplomatic, and military channels. He has also, been commenting on developments in border areas. So I'll now request, Sushant to share with us his insights of developments over the last 2 years.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ambassador Kant and ICS for inviting me to be a part of this panel. A lot has happened in the past 2 years of the border crisis in Ladakh, even though the denial of official information has kept much under wraps. It must be reiterated that other than some official statements from PIB, which provide minimal information, there's been no official briefing or parliamentary discussion or report of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on this subject matter. Even journalists have not been taken to the border areas in Ladakh to provide authentic and first-hand information. That having said, we still know a lot about the crisis. To begin with, the crisis in Ladakh, with troops facing each other, was at its peak at 7 or 8 points on the line of actual control by mid to late 2020. But when it began, well before May 2020, it was at 3 different and discrete places: Depsang up in the north, Pangong, so the north bank of Pangong Lake, and Galvan. Clashes are happening, and patrols were being blocked regularly in this area in Ladakh in late 2019 and early 2020, as we know by now, particularly in the area of Pangong. There were very severe clashes which were taking place at that point in time. Ambassador Bambawale has already spoken of the 2 major underlying reasons of the crisis, but as the outgoing Army Chief General Narwane said a couple of days ago, we still don't know what happened and why did it happen at that point in time. But in Depsang, a long-standing informal agreement, which General Huda probably knows more about, and I've learned a lot from him, broke down in early 2020, which led to the blockage of Indian patrols at a place called Bottleneck, denying them access to 5 patrol points. In Pangong, the extent of clashes, a regular feature in that area historically, became much more intense. And when Indians were trying to construct some basic infrastructure in Galvan to improve their patrolling posture, not even matching what was already existing on the Chinese side, things seems to have completely gone out of hand in early 2020. In early May of 2020, the PLA moved vast number of troops and equipment, diverting them from its annual military exercise onto the line of actual control, taking positions inside the line of actual control on the Indian side, or what India believes to be on its side, on PP-15, PP-17A, and Demchok, besides building up its strength in Galvan and Pangong Lake, the north bank of Pangong Lake. India also responded, and using the airlift capacity of the Indian Air Force, moved troops from various peace and operational locations to mirror the Chinese deployment in end May and early June. And these troops were really moved from all over India. This was the peak of the pandemic. Pandemic had just started. India was in a lockdown. Indian Air Force was being used for various other things, but they really quickly moved around and pushed the troops into Ladakh. There were talks that were going on at military commanders level, at the divisional commanders and the corps commanders level at that time. The hotline was active, but despite these talks, the situation worsened when a physical clash took place in Galvan on June 15th, June 16th night, which everybody has spoken about. 20 Indian soldiers died in that clash. Another 80 were taken captive by the PLA, which was subsequently released over the next 48 hours. The PLA claimed that there were only 4 casualties of their own. Both the clash, the dead PLA soldiers, and the Galvan location itself has since become a big part of the Chinese Communist Party narrative in the last 2 years. Whatever we have seen being put out on social media, through Chinese platforms, through the PLA Daily, these seems to have attained a very high degree of visibility in the Chinese Communist Party narrative, which was not true for a lot of other clashes or other areas which we have seen over the last 5 to 7 years, whether it may be Chumar, whether it may be Doklam or anything. Somehow this seems to have been pushed much, much higher up. The buildup by both sides, as Ambassador Kanta said, led to nearly 50 to 60,000 soldiers, plus a lot of artillery pieces, a lot of armored vehicles and tanks and UAVs being pushed into the area. What I learned was that the Indian military there has satellite-based visibility into the Chinese side, where they get information with a delay of barely 24 hours. There is information being shared by friendly foreign countries as well with India, which is giving India very good visibility onto the Chinese side. By mid-2020, talks between military commanders are taking place in July, in early July, where news would come that there was some kind of a breakthrough. It seemed to promise a lot, but little was delivered on the ground at that point in time. By end August, India decided to move in and put in action the plan, which has been a long-standing tactics going back to the Sundarji era of the mid-1980s, a quid pro quo operation to get the Chinese to revert to status quo ante. Indian Army decided to go and occupy the Kailash range on the south bank of Pangong Lake, but was careful to stay onto the own side of the LAC. It did not actually occupy the dominating features which it believes are on the Chinese side of the LAC, which it could have easily done. But even then, it led to an eyeball-to-eyeball situation with both sides firing hundreds of rounds onto each other. Rockets were being fired from both sides by each other. There was a serious threat of escalation at that point in time when India moved on to the Kailash range, as PLA moved its combined armed division to the area up from the north, for which now they've constructed a new bridge over Pangong so that they can come much more quickly, much more easily than what they did at that point in time. Most of us at that point in time were not aware as to how tense the situation between the two armies was. Having spoken to my postmates who were commanding brigades there, and even to other senior military commanders who were in location at that point in time, they say they lost whatever little hair that they had because they were genuinely worried about an escalation at that point in time. And I think it is that fear of escalation from both sides, from both the Indian side and the Chinese side, that led to those talks, which led to the breakthrough in January, where the first disengagement took place in Pangong and Kailash range, both on the north bank as well as the south bank of Pangong Lake, as well as on the Kailash range. This disengagement, as Ambassador Kant mentioned earlier, only means stepping back by a couple of miles so that you are no longer face to face, so that the accidental escalation, which Ambassador Bambawale spoke about, does not happen. But it is not de-escalation. De-escalation is when you go into your own locations in the area, some 50 to 100 miles away. So it would take you a couple of days at least to come back. And there is no danger of any accidental escalation taking place. De-induction, of course, is out of question because troops they are not going out on Ladakh or Aksai Chin at all. So far, 15 rounds of talks between military commanders in which the foreign ministry officials have also been present, have taken place, and 8 rounds of WMCC talks have already happened. 3 areas remain where no disengagement has still taken place. In other areas where disengagement has taken place, a buffer zone has been created. These 3 unresolved areas are Depsang, PP15, and Demchok. PP15, I believe, is likely to be resolved soon. It's only a minor disagreement over where the Indian troops should go to. But once it is agreed upon, that is likely to be resolved. As of now, troops are being regularly rotated by both sides. People are coming fresher, people are coming from other areas. So it's almost like a deployment like at any other place where troops are being moved and rotated from other areas. And this is all happening despite the pandemic. And a lot of infrastructure has been built up on both sides. A flatter terrain gives PLA a bigger advantage. And of course, it has done major infrastructure creation, major infrastructure construction. But India has also used this opportunity to do much more than what it would have done otherwise in Ladakh. It had not done as much in Ladakh in so many years as it has been able to do in last 2 years. But let us also not forget that China has an economy 6 times India's size and defense spending, which is nearly 4 times India's defense spending. And this gap has only increased in the last 5 to 6 years. As Ambassador Bambawale's report, was it last year or was it in 2020, when he spoke about how India should deal with China, reminded us very, very clearly. As part of its strategy to deal with this crisis, India has undertaken major internal military rebalancing. Troops earmarked for Pakistan border have been reoriented towards the China border, and major shifting of responsibilities has taken place all along the line of actual control. There have been major exercises, both tabletop as well as physical, on dealing with PLA's gray zone operations. Simultaneously, external rebalancing has taken place through the Quad and as part of cooperation with Western powers in the Indo-Pacific. More importantly, military and diplomatically, India's attention and energies have been focused towards China now. But it also means that land borders have gained priority, and in a weak economy, our efforts in the seas have taken a backseat. The China crisis has also meant that India has opened lines of communication towards Pakistan, which has tempered the vicious domestic political rhetoric on Pakistan to an extent. India is essentially worried about preventing a two-front collusive military threat from China and Pakistan, which military commanders say can only be prevented by a whole of nation approach and not be left only to the military. To sum up, at 4 points in Ladakh border, disengagement has taken place, whereas in 3 places, troops continue to remain facing each other. No disengagement has taken place. But Indian patrols continue to be denied access as they earlier had to various patrolling points, either because of the buffer zones that have been created or because of the blockage by the PLA. Nearly 50 to 60,000 soldiers from either both sides are there with equipment and with infrastructure which is much better than what existed there before the crisis began. There have been talks at political level, although in a multilateral format or only at the level of the ministers. There have been diplomatic engagements and there have been military level talks. And thus it seems that these talks could lead to some solution at some point in time. But till the time that solution is reached, this new normal which has been established will continue to prevail, where soldiers will continue to remain deployed where they're deployed, facing each other through the harshest of the winters. The big worry for someone like me, and when I speak to the military commanders, is of an accidental escalation with Pakistan at that time, such as that could have happened with the accidental firing of the BrahMos missile, because such an accidental escalation could actually put India under tremendous pressure, militarily and strategically, if any such situation were to occur with Pakistan. Also, finally, as Ambassador Bambawale also spoke of, restoration of status quo ante remains one of the goals, particularly of the military leadership. But at this point in time, it almost seems like a mirage. We have to live with this new altered reality and work towards ensuring that there are no further losses, and then hope that some kind of permanent solution can be found in the long run. Sir, I'll end here, Ambassador Kanta. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sushant, for that excellent overview of what has happened over the last 2 years, for bringing out developments both on the military side as well as in talks between India and China to address the outstanding issues. As Sushant mentioned, there has been limited disengagement at 4 points in eastern Ladakh, but the situation of close proximity continues at 3 points, including PP-15, Depsam Plains, and Demchok. Sushant also talked about internal military rebalancing that India has carried out, and an element of external rebalancing as well. Very rightly, he highlighted the aspect of new normal emerging in terms of situation along India-China borders, and this is this altered reality, as he put it, is an uncomfortable situation, an abnormal situation. Thank you very much, Sushant. Now I turn to our third speaker, Senior Colonel Chopo, who will give us a Chinese perspective on these developments. Senior Colonel Chopo is an old interlocutor for us, someone who is well-informed, seasoned. He's senior fellow with Center for International Security and Strategy, Tsinghua University. I'll now request him to give us some insights on how China approaches this border crisis and efforts being made by 2 countries to resolve the present situation.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Master Kanta. It's so nice to see so many other Indian friends. I realize I'm the only Chinese on this occasion. And as I talked to Sushant Singh last time in our interview, that I'm probably one of the very few Chinese who can actually cite the Indian dishes in Indian name. So that shows my my familiarity, unlike other Chinese, with something Indian. And this is truly memorable. This is a very, very serious topic for us. And as a staff officer who actually has been desk officer for South Asia for 10 years, I remember I said before in our bilateral talks that I wish this kind of things will never happen again. So making use of this conference to find out how we might possibly avoid such things from happening again, let me repeat what I said before, that this kind of the most unfortunate incident occurred on 16th June 2020 is not ambush from the Chinese side, because there is no reason whatsoever for us to do that. Just now I remember Ambassador Bambawal cited two reasons, one tactical, another strategic, of China in doing this. I disagree totally. I don't think there is such an intention for us to do that. The reason is, you see, China's overall situation nowadays is deteriorating with this so-called major power competition ushered in by Donald Trump. China is not looking really seriously at the Sino-Indian border to create a problem. And this reminds me of the time when India conducted its nuclear test in 1998, citing China as potential threat number one. China was really, really shocked, because at that time too, China was focusing on Taiwan Strait because of the so-called Taiwanese president Lee Teng-hui was promoting this kind of independent moves. So when the Indians suddenly said China was a potential threat number one, almost immediately after Chinese chief of the general staff visit to India, it was shocking to China. So right now, China again is focusing on many other issues, primarily China-US relationship and the Taiwan issue, South China Sea, so on and so forth. So yes, China is doing border construction like Indians, but there is no reason why China would suddenly attention to the border to the extent that it needs to kill Indian soldiers to demonstrate anything. That is totally wrong. I need to point out this, because if you believe China did this deliberately, that will be a huge harm to you logically. This cannot be the case. You see, I give you a logic. Just now, Ambassador Bambawal mentioned that even during President Xi Jinping's visit to India, there was a standoff, right? So how could possibly a standoff occurred during my present visit to India? Do we want to do that deliberately? Of course not. So that again shows, that again is accidental. That shows how difficult it is to manage our problem. But that certainly is not what we have wished. I think maybe this is the best example to show you that we're not doing it deliberately. So how to solve this problem? Basically, I believe there's no way for us to solve this problem, but what we can do are quite a few things which are not really difficult. First of all, we should disengage from the most dangerous places. This is self-evident. Second, I believe we should implement all those most easy competence building measures that are already written in all the documents from 1993 to 2003. The 10 years basically are the golden time for competence building measures, not only between China and India, but it is much, much more comprehensive and substantive than any other competence building measures between China and other countries. We have we do not have more competence building measures with any other countries than with India. frankly speaking. So, in fact, I cannot think there are any other new competence building measures that have to be put in place if we can actually implement what are already existing in this competence building measures. So third, I think it is most important that we should avoid the is the clash of the soldiers on the two sides, let alone shooting at each other. Yeah. Fourth, I believe, in spite of what Ambassador Bambawal said, that this kind of border problem should not affect other relationships. In fact, I think I have read some discrepancy in the remarks of Ambassador Bambawal when he talked about how during your Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China, both sides have actually reached a consensus of not letting the border issue overshadowing all other issues. So still, this might be a principle for us. Think of this. Even if the political leaders or the senior diplomats in India want to make it conditional for other issues, could you actually do that? No, because you see, the business, the trading between us actually have their own momentum and they are self-propelling. So even if you want, you still want both sides to do trading. So that is why we should actually develop wherever possible while we are trying our best to manage the problems. So finally, I believe that given the political structures of our two countries, it is important for the leaders to have a direct talk. And for that to happen, I believe it's important for us to create the atmosphere for that. That would have been most relevant, that would be most productive. And for that to happen, you should create some kind of atmosphere. Do not always, blame China, and do not always behave as if you do not want to interact with China, even if you agree that China's foreign minister could come visit India. So this is what I wish to say in terms of the border. Then I want to talk about something else, some other bigger issues. The first question is how we should look at other, given the geopolitical and economic changes in the world. You see, by 2030, China would become the largest economy in the world, and you would become the largest economy in Asia. So in less than 10 years' time, both China and India will grow with strength. And when China stands in the center of East Asia, India is not so far away, and Indonesia is not so far away. So this will definitely happen in spite of the war, in Europe continent. So the Russian-Ukraine war raised me a question. So Ambassador Kanda, I remember last time you talked how we are still different in terms of our view toward this war. I agree, and I thank you for that because I actually wasn't so much aware of the differences, but still I would believe our common points actually are much more, because what you said to me is like telling me this apple is different from other apple. But it's not a difference between one apple and one pear. Why? Because talk about the main point, how we share our understanding of the Russia's concern and how we stress about the sovereignty of other countries. We didn't coordinate with each other, right? So we didn't coordinate with each other. So we just talk about this, and they happen to be almost the same or very much similar. So this proves how much we actually had in common. Frankly speaking, I believe in the last few years, because of what happened in Galvan Valley. India actually was playing a lot of pretension. You pretend to be very much close to India, and you pretend that you are a club member of Quad. But in fact, the Quad cannot become an anti-China club. Yeah, so many Chinese people say that. I never believe that. Actually, I have more confidence in your independent foreign policy. Yeah, because it serves your best interest if you stand neutral. But in spite of what you said, that the Indian Ocean should be open and free, like America, the United States still challenge you, right? The United States still send ships into your exclusive economic zone. And the Seventh Fleet would read a statement of challenging your so-called excessive maritime rights. So I have studied your law, and I found your maritime law actually is very much close to that of China. Actually, you are more strict because you would not allow the foreign ships military exercises in your exclusive economic zone without consent of the Indian government. And your reservation for the UN Convention Law is the same, like China's, even for the same article, Article 298. So we're very much close on these positions. Now, I start to think of one question. Which country is more important for China in the future, India or Russia? I know this is not a good way to compare, but I can't help, from thinking about this issue since the war started. I know both China and India have good relationship with Russia, but Russia's war with Ukraine, no matter how reasonable in responding to NATO's expansion, cannot be said to be legitimate. Both of us actually have suffered a bit in terms of our credibility and reputation because we refuse to overtly condemning Russia. Of course, China and Russia will continue to be strategic partners, but we want to be an ally. There are many reasons why, but my thinking is because we have a fundamental difference in our outlooks regarding international order. Russia resents the existing international order with a victimhood. In other words, Russia looks to the future from the past. Russia is nostalgic of the Russian Empire, while China is the biggest beneficiary, and I believe India is also a big beneficiary from the globalization, which functions basically on the rules and regulations laid down by the West after the Second World War. So we too are beneficiaries, not Russia. So I'm thinking about Russia's future. Russia, the international position will definitely decline because, its image is already tarnished and its economy highly dependent on export of resources would become not so reliable because of Western sanctions in the future. And demographically, its population is coming down. So apart from the largest nuclear arsenal, how important would Russia be 20 years from now? I do not have a ready answer for this question, but I'm starting to think, which country is more important for China, India or Russia, really? Yeah. So that means in spite of our problems, the only problem, the border problem, I actually think really, really positively about the future of our relationship. I believe because India really will become much more important. Yeah. So about India's position, India's direction development in the future. According to what I read, India actually has already made gradual changes toward this policy toward Russia. You are actually decreasing or procurement of Russian-made weapons. I don't want to comment on this because this is totally your own affairs. But I believe this would be American purpose of having you're reducing arms procurement from Russia and to increase your importing of American arms. I don't know what kind of strategy you are going to have, but I think both of us know that Russia didn't fight quite well in the Ukrainian war. So that might affect India's confidence about the Russian weapon system. This doesn't matter that much to me because, as I said, this is not China's matter. But in my talks with some Indian scholars last time, I found one argument most interesting. That is, if China gets ever closer to Russia, probably India will get ever closer with the United States. I'm really confused, and I wish some people could shed some light on this for me, because I know India and Russia's relationship have a longer history with more rapprochement. But why, if China get close to Russia, then India would get close to the United States? Does India believe that its a problem with China is so irreconcilable that it has to be aligned with the United States to take on China? I truly feel confused. I hope maybe some people can help me out. Thank you.
Thank you, Senior Colonel Chopo, for sharing your thoughts with us, not only on the topic for today's discussion, border crisis along India-China borders, but also, some other very pertinent issues today, including, as you noted, there are common points in positions taken by India and China with regard to the Ukrainian crisis. Colonel Chopo has argued that there was no ambush of India as such from the Chinese side, that China did not take any deliberate action which changed the status quo along India-China LAC, as it was focused on other issues, including its relations with USA and South China Sea. Senior Colonel Chopo has drawn attention to a very comprehensive architecture of confidence-building measures we have in India and China, and the need to implement them rather than trying to work out the new CBMs. Thank you for your comments, which I'm sure will provoke more questions later today. I now turn to our fourth speaker, General D.S. Huda, former General Officer Commanding-in-Chief, Northern Command, and co-founder of Council for Strategic and Strategic Affairs and Senior Fellow of Delhi Policy Group. General Huda has been commenting in a very thoughtful and insightful manner about issues relating to India's defense, including India-China border matter. And today we are requesting him to suggest what could be the way out, the way ahead of the present imbroglio. I'd also request him to comment on some of the points made by Senior Colonel Chopo, including his contention that there is no need to work out new CBMs between India and China because existing CBMs quite suffice. The need is really to implement those CBMs. So over to you, General Huda.
So thank you very much, Ambassador, and it's a great pleasure to be here among such distinguished speakers. As you said, I'm going to talk about the way ahead and the way ahead to start with, to see how we can resolve the situation in Eastern Ladakh. because I think that is having a large sort of impact on overall bilateral relations. And if that issue is resolved, perhaps better normalization of bilateral relations can take place. So let me start with that aspect first. What is the place of the situation at the LAC in our bilateral relations? And we've heard speakers from both, the Indian side and the Chinese side, and obviously there is a difference in perception. While the Chinese would like to insulate whatever is happening along the LAC, along the border, insulate that from the larger bilateral relations. As Ambassador Bambawale has pointed out, I think the Indian officials, the foreign minister, the foreign secretary, have made it quite clear that as long as the situation on the border remains the way it is, it cannot be business as usual. And there is going to be an impact on bilateral relations. Now we can go back into history and keep arguing about whether India and China had in the late 80s, early 90s decided to keep the border issue separate from overall bilateral relations. But the fact is, we have to listen to the message that is coming out from the Indian officials today. And I think the message is quite clear that unless the situation at the LAC is normalized, bilateral relations will continue to be adversely affected. So I think I would request, my Chinese friends to understand this and take that message. There is no point continuing to say that, both these issues must be kept aside. I think on numerous occasions, this aspect has been made clear. And if there is, we come to this understanding together that yes, the border situation is impacting bilateral relations, then possibly we can find ways to move forward. So that is my sort of first, suggestion that please read the loud and clear message that is being given out by Indian officials. The second point I want to make is that India must stand firm on its demand to restore the status quo ante. I know Sushant has said that this is difficult and may not happen, but the fact is, unless status quo ante is restored, I don't see how the additional forces, 50, 60,000 troops that have been inducted from both sides, I don't see how they are going to pull back. And if they are not going to pull back, it has been pointed out that tensions will remain. Inadvertently, some things might happen. Local incidents might spiral out of control. So the status quo ante has to be restored. And when I say status quo ante is restored, it means the pullback of PLA soldiers who have come across what we perceive as our perception of the LAC, and to go back to situations as it existed probably in April 2020. And I think that's I don't see how India is going to back down on that demand. And so that is something again that needs to be sort of considered by the Chinese side, because unless that happens, as I said, the realignment of forces that is taking place, the additional forces that are already in place, all that is not going to happen. On the issue of confidence building measures, and yes, the confidence building measures that have been put in place have held peace for a large number of years, and I agree with it. Can we continue to rely on those and say, let's go back to those CBMs and ensure that they are followed in totality? My views are different. Having been there, having served there, what I've seen over the years is a steady dilution in confidence building measures that were in place. And this has not happened in 2020. Right from 2013, 14, 15 onwards, we are seeing a steady dilution in confidence building measures. We are seeing physical scuffles taking place. We are seeing how patrols who are meeting each other in what are considered disputed areas are not going back. We are seeing permanent presence of troops. We are seeing additional forces being built up close to the LAC. So I'm afraid, yes, the CBMs were there. We could take some of those, which we think are useful from the old CBMs. But I think there is a need to sit down and renegotiate CBMs. If nothing, they will do good for the lack of trust that is crept in both sides. There is mistrust, there is suspicion. because of what has happened in 2020. And therefore, I think there is a need to sit down and renegotiate these CBMs. We also need to take into consideration some new aspects. For example, notification of large-scale movements that are taking place close to the LAC. I think we need to talk about that. We need to talk about patrolling patterns. We need to talk about aspects of infrastructure development, both military and civilian, because this is again one issue on infrastructure development that causes a fair amount of suspicion on both sides. So, because we heard things like just because we were creating the DSDB road was one reason why the Chinese decided to come inside into the Galvan Valley. So we need to, I think, clearly identify disputed areas. So we had in the past, we've had some areas called agreed disputed areas, but large number of other disputed areas have cropped up where there are differing perceptions of the LAC. I think there is a need to identify first these disputed areas where differing perceptions of the LAC lie, and then what should be the pattern of military activity in these disputed areas. This is something that that needs to be talked about, and the establishment of hotlines. And I know we already have a number of hotlines, but do we need additional hotlines to ensure local incidents are quickly settled? Do we need hotline, between Beijing and Delhi? It's something that has been again talked about for a very long time, but has not taken place. So I would suggest that maybe it's time to sit down, relook this whole area of confidence building measures, see what are the aspects that are creating tension now, or have created tension in the past 5 or 6 years, and then look at trying to resolve those issues. And some of those, as I said, I have sort of pointed out to you. Infrastructure development, movement close to the LAC, identification of disputed areas. These are some aspects that we could look at in our confidence building measures. My next point is on, it would be good if both sides could pull back additional troops. The fact that 50 to 60,000 soldiers remain in close vicinity of the LAC on both sides could lead to, as I said, inadvertent escalation. So it would be good if both the sides can pull back these additional troops. Let me bring out here the Indian perspective of the difficulty in doing that is because the infrastructure is much more developed on the Chinese side in Tibet. Infrastructure is lesser developed on our side. Time taken to mobilize forces is much more on the Indian side as compared to the Chinese side. So there is some reluctance on the Indian side to pull back additional troops unless there is an agreement on disengagement. So I know this is also, as I said, people say, why don't we pull back these additional forces? And I have brought out the Indian perspective and the Indian military perspective on this. It will happen, but it will happen only once there is disengagement and there is some agreement that takes place. And my final point is that I think both sides must get serious about identification of the LAC. The border issue, in my view, is fairly complicated, is something that will take time. But we need to sit down together and restart this exercise of at least talking to each other about where does the LAC lie. And again, it's going to be a difficult, long, somewhat torturous process in identification. But this is one thing that can actually help completely ease the situation along the LAC. Why are we having problem areas today? Where do incidents take place? They only take place because the understanding of LAC on both sides is different and there is no common perception. So again, as I said, difficult and a long process, but something that both sides need to seriously consider and restart the process. So this is, a few suggestions I had as far as moving ahead and to see how the current situation can be somewhat normalized so that we can bring in improvement in our bilateral relations. Thank you very much. I'll stop here and I'll take any questions if there are.
Thank you very much, General Huda, for those comments and for giving some very thoughtful and practical suggestions on the way ahead. General Huda very rightly pointed out that Chinese friends should take a clear message from Indian side that they cannot be back to business as usual until we can address the present predicament in border areas and restore status quo ante. General Huda has also argued that there's need to sit down and negotiate confidence building measures in India-China border areas, take into account changed and evolving situation, including large-scale induction of troops, patrolling patterns which have emerged, build up in terms of infrastructure activities on both sides, need to identify disputed pockets where both sides have differing perceptions as to alignment with the LAC. I think this is a very valid suggestion he has made. General Huda also suggested that there is need to de-escalate and pull back through additional troops, but that can happen only when we have disengagement of forces in close proximity. Thank you for those suggestions, including on resumption of the process of LAC clarification and confirmation. I'll now turn to our discussant, Dr. Ritusha Manitibari, and ask her to offer her comments on 4 very good presentations we had from a distinguished panel. Over to you, Ritusha.
Thank you, Ambassador Kantha. And I also thank all the speakers who have in a very focused manner, given some very sharp points of observation. The task that is left to me is basically to kind of cull out what they have said so far. And my 2 bits are as follows. The still unresolved Ladakh crisis has indeed created a new reality. And it was pointed out by one of the speakers, Mr. Sushant. I would also like to toy with the idea whether it's a new strategic reality which is here to stay. One which is marked by renewed political hostility between India and China, and an increased militarization of the line of actual control. If we deconstruct this new strategic reality, one of the biggest imbalances that we see in this particular newness is the military cost. Due to the border crisis with China, India is likely to defer not just the much needed investment for amping its economic and social needs, prioritizing border security over them, but also the overall pursuance of military modernization and maritime expansion aimed at other segments of its border, including the Indian Ocean. So in that sense, India can foresee a kind of huge military cost. Not to mention that such a cost tips the balance in favor of China evermore. For Ambassador Bambawale in that context, my question goes as follows. Is there an imbalance in the quantum of strategic cost that India and China experience when the border dispute or when the border situation deteriorates? Is it because of this imbalance that China is unable to breach the consensual understanding unilaterally? And I would also like to link it with what Mr. Sushant had earlier called as the new normal or new reality. And in that context, my question to Sushant is, can we envisage a post-crisis new reality? Perhaps an increased militarization of the LAC and an inter-theater rebalancing of forces on the part of India, which may point towards certain features of strategic adaptations owing to this new post-crisis reality. And can you kind of show some, can you throw some light on what could be some of the likely Chinese responses in that case of strategic adaptation by China? For Senior Colonel Chopo, my question is that in case of China, is the cost of deteriorating relations between China and India more perceived than realized, so far as the current affairs or current state of affairs goes between India and China? Is it because of this that the cost assessment of escalation points towards relatively lower levels, which seems to be rather manageable for China, which is what instigates this comparison about whether China can choose between, say, India and Russia, as you pointed out in your piece? If that is not the case, what are some of the common offset strategies that can be envisaged to deter any accidental skirmishes that enable a proper implementation of CBMs, as you were pointing out? I would go out on a limb and stretch the argument to include the question whether there is a possibility of any mechanism that considerably reduces intentional skirmishes as well. So your comments on that. Finally, to Lieutenant General D.S. Huda, India's new strategic reality is not just limited to Ladakh. India faces increased threats and uncertainty all along the LAC. So at the operational level, long-term increased militarization of the LAC seems all but inescapable. Even if we go by the February 2021 disengagement plan, and we see we can foresee its execution, if at all that happens, which may lead to, as you pointed out, new confidence building measures. India's distrust, so far as the border situation goes, will likely demand a heavier military posture, thereby enabling rapid mobilization at the LAC. Now, short of that kind of new border management architecture, where does it leave India? Perhaps a larger military presence on the border virtually indefinitely? As we can see, the Indian Army has begun to rebalance its forces. The most significant expression of this rebalancing to date was the reorientation of a combined armed strike corps to focus on China. In December 2020, the Indian Army ordered one of those formations to prepare for a new operational role, launching offensive strikes across the LAC in Ladakh. So this rebalancing is a major cost commitment on the part of India, which means greater resources directed towards the LAC. Therefore, this is perhaps not a temporary phenomenon at all, but a permanent reassignment of the forces. So your comment on that, General. I'll stop here, and maybe more questions can come up in our discussion round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ritusha, for both offering your comments on the presentations and posing some very searching questions for four speakers. So what we'll do now, we'll turn to the four speakers, request them to respond to your questions, beginning with Gautam, then Sushant, then Chopo, and finally General Huda. Gautam, can you start?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Tiwari. That was a very thought-provoking and a very thoughtful question that you posed me, which was the question of whether the relative cost of a live LAC, a live border between India and China, is greater on India, which has a smaller economy, a $3 trillion economy, as compared to China, which has a $15 trillion economy. And the answer to your question is, of course, yes, that the relative costs on India will be higher. But when it comes down to a question of national security, of territorial integrity and national sovereignty, most nation states have to pay that price and are willing to pay that price. We're seeing little Ukraine doing that right now vis-a-vis Russia. And I think India will also have to pay that relatively higher cost to ensure territorial integrity. There are two other points that I would like to make, which are in continuation of this, the very good question which was raised by the discussant. And that is, in the long term, what India will try to do is try to narrow this gap in comparative, comprehensive national strength, if you want to call it, in comparative national power, if you want to call it that way. But this relative power differential between India and China, India in the longer run will try to reduce that by growing at faster rates of GDP growth per annum, 8%, 9%, maybe even 10% over a longer period of time. But that is in the long run. What does India do in the short run? And this is where I would like to address this question to Senior Colonel Chaubo, that he did speak very eloquently of how China and the rise of China is really now a competition between the United States on the one hand and China on the other. But Senior Colonel Chaubo, by taking the action that China has done since April 2020, May 2020, in Eastern Ladakh, which we have been discussing over these past hour and a half, don't you think that China has actually pushed India closer to the United States? And from a strategic point of view, in the short term, that is what India will do. India will move closer to the United States, to the UK, to France, to Germany, to Japan, to Australia, in order to balance Chinese power. So I'll stop there and hand the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you. Sushant?
Thank you, Dr. Tiwari. That was a fantastic question. There are two kinds of post-crisis realities which can be envisaged. The first reality could be, the model which has evolved out of this disengagement that we have seen in Ladakh on the border per se, a kind of border management using creation of buffer zones, which avoids any chance of conflict or any chance of escalation that may happen, leading to tensions that we have witnessed over the last decade or so between India and China. This is something which was also attempted at Wuhan in the informal summit between General Secretary Xi and Prime Minister Modi. That could be the one option, one future which we can envisage, which probably the PLA and the Chinese side would also be comfortable with, unless they want to use this as an excuse to put India under pressure. And the second reality, or the second more harsher reality which we can envisage, is probably an LOCization of the line of actual control, which many military commanders are scared of, that this kind of deployment, as General Huda also referred to, could become a permanent feature on the line of actual control, and in fact, even in other areas of the line of actual control, which would not be a very healthy scenario, particularly as we have witnessed on the line of control with Pakistan, despite a ceasefire, as to how things proceed and go in that case. And with India, as Ambassador Bawale said, being a small economic and military power, it would really put India on the back foot if that reality were to take place. That would be the new reality were to take place.
Thank you. Thank you, Sushant. May I now request Senior Colonel Chopo to respond to Ritusha's question? And he may also like to respond to Gautam's question.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador Kamda. First, to Tiwari's question. Actually, I'm trying to answer what I believe to be the undertone from all Indian speakers. That is, China still did this deliberately. So as I pointed out in the beginning, if China did it deliberately, that would be a great harm to use logically. And I believe I have given you the best example of how we still had the one standoff, even during President Xi Jinping's visit in India, right? He should not have ordered Chinese troops to have a standoff with Indians while he was visiting India. That was the last thing he wanted. So it is accidental. And when you talk about, from April 2020, actually this kind of tension or South atmosphere began to build until it exploded in the mid-June. So that is important for me to point out. And Tiwari's question basically is also something like that, whether China would be willing to use this bigger weight, to actually have a low-level conflict that he believes is manageable. No, I don't think so. As I have said, China is fully aware how important India is. And basically, you are also a nuclear weapons state, despite the fact that you cannot be called a nuclear weapons state according to NPT. But so I believe basically the chance of a China winning over India along the border without heavy casualty is gone. It won't be in 1960. So the casualty on both sides would be heavy, so it's not worthwhile at all. What measures to take then? Here I would like to answer General Huda's comments. I'm totally fine if you believe that we should have some new confidence building measures in place. That is absolutely fine. But I was impressed with how detailed those old CBMs were. And I believe if you try to put some old wine in the new bottle, it's still old wine. I'm happy if you can find some new compatibility measures, because now we're in a new era and the leaderships are also new. So if they believe they can, you can throw out some new ideas, which actually are old ideas, it doesn't matter. It's fine for me, no problem. Yeah. So that's fine for me. And then finally, to Ambassador Bambawali's good comment, hasn't China's behavior pushing India actually to the United States? Well, I believe that the incident in Galvan Valley has indeed pushed India to the US camp. That is for sure. Because that's not what we want to see. But again, let me point out that that is not what China has engineered. Precisely because we know that we do not want to push you to the US camp. Therefore, it is impossible for China to do anything like that. I also suffered a casualty. It's not that we are having a landslide victory along the line of actual control. So we also had a casualty. It's most unfortunate, but after saying what I said about the overall relationship, the change in the new international order, I believe we have to solve we have to set aside the differences. As I said earlier, I'm totally for any possible compatibility measures that could actually disengage both of us. Because so long as we are still engaged in a kind of eyeball-to-eyeball situation, I believe it's difficult for us to have a significant improvement of our bilateral relationship. And General Huda mentioned a very good suggestion to reduce additional forces. I totally agree. Yeah. Well, according to our 1993 agreement, we should keep the lowest possible military presence along the line of control. And why should we even have additional forces if we do not want to fight against each other? I totally agree. Thank you.
Thank you. May I now request General Huda to respond?
So thank you very much. A good question. Is there increased threat along the LAC? The answer is yes. Are we looking at long-term militarization? And I think the answer is yes. See, I think the basic point is that the way the army and the other forces that are there, security forces, the way we do border management is obviously based on our perception of the threat and what is happening on the other side and how the PLA is behaving. So all this while, let me use the term, it was like soft management of the border. Yes, incursions were taking place, but there was no violence. Patrols were coming, they were going back. I recall in the year 2015, we had about 50 border meetings with the Chinese in Eastern Ladakh alone, which is almost one a week. That's the level of sort of engagement that was going on at the local level. So some of these were to discuss patrol incursions. Some of these were obviously, on days like Diwali and 1st May, etc., etc. So almost 50 meetings we had in 2015. Obviously, all that has unfortunately changed. What is the Indian Army's strategy along the border? It's a strategy of deterrence, to deter the use of military force for coercion against India. And if our perception of that deterrence strategy was that the PLA is not going to use military force in large numbers along the border earlier, that perception now has changed after what happened in April 2020. And so you are seeing a relocation of forces. You are going to see greater deployment of troops in the short term. Is this going to become permanent? I do not know. Because as we go forward, the use of technology, use of surveillance, all those aspects, when they get built in, you could see that adding to the posture along the border, and not necessarily that there is going to be for the next 15, 20 years dependence only on boots on the ground. So you could see a change in posture, but yes, it will be, as you say, it will be, I don't want to use the word militarized, but it will be a stronger deterrence posture. It will be a stronger defensive posture along the LAC. That is something I think that we are going to see in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, General Huda. Well, we have a number of questions in the chat box, but given paucity of time, I'll call out 4 questions from chat box, one for each speaker. Let me start with a question by Apurva Raj in the chat box, and request Master Gautam Bambawale to respond to it. The questions are about internal politics, affecting behavior on the border issue. And will Gautam like to comment on to what extent this shaping behavior on the Chinese side?
Sorry, shall I take it on right away?
Yeah, okay. Why don't you start? Yeah.
Okay, I'll be quick because I know that we are short of time and we don't want to be too long-winded on this. But yes, that's an excellent question, and that politics, internal politics, not only in China, but possibly also in other countries, does have an impact on external policies. But at the same time, I think, we have to also realize that where China is concerned, the top leader, the General Secretary of the party, Mr. Xi Jinping, is in complete control and command of the country, of the party, of the military. And therefore, we will not be wrong if we come to the conclusion that most important decisions on these matters will go up to him and will flow from him downwards. So I think I'll stop there. I think I have tried to take on your question and try to answer it to the best of my ability, because I'm not an expert on China's internal policies and politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Gautam. Second question is directed towards Senior Colonel Chopo. Question in the chat box is from a colleague in YouTube channel. He or she would like to know what was the immediate causal factor of the Galvan border clash. Was it some action on the Indian side that provoked China, or was it something else?
Well, I think this kind of incident is mutually interactive, because, as I said, there's this kind of south atmosphere has built on for quite some time until it exploded in mid-June. So I'm as a scholar, I would not point I think at the Indian side to say you are provoking me first, because it's very difficult for us to find out, because the line of active control is not very fine. So well, it reminds me about General Huda's suggestion that we have to come back to the verification of actual control. I believe that would be most useful if we can really do it. We can't do it. The problem is that I think it is around 2000 when the Chinese negotiators went to India. We had an exchange of maps, and we actually are shocked because we saw in your maps there are more places of distribution, much more than we thought. So we just couldn't even agree, on what kind of places are disputed, but they are more than what we saw. So some people believe that you are just making use of this fact to enlarge the disputed area for your own gains. So in other words, there are too many for us to swallow. There's the problem, the difficulties. So whether we could have top leaders make a political decision, I personally have some doubts. I don't believe it is possible either. I think some people in China said that we actually lost the chance when Chairman Deng Xiaoping made a proposal about the mutual accommodation, mutual understanding, mutual accommodation. But that chance was gone. So the only thing is that we live with reality. But the reality, what I believe, that the border should be heavy with military presence. I believe it is still possible for us, at least the soldiers, to make sure that we do not fight against each other, even physically, with a wooden club on the force. This can be managed. I think this can be managed. You see, I forgot one thing. Although people have some doubts about the usefulness of the conflict building measures, but the fact is, our two soldiers not try to shoot at each other. The fact that they fought against each other with wooden club demonstrates that they know they should not fire at each other in any circumstances. That is good. And we should actually start from that, to tell them you should not fight against each other at all. And this could be managed if the political leadership give instruction to the senior commanders and then on to the soldiers. We can do that, I believe.
Thank you. There is a question from Abhishek Pandey in the chat box, which I'll request Sushant to respond to. The question refers to the current stalemate and an unlikelihood of progress towards restoration as status quo ante, and inquires whether, given the current churn in global economy, the Ukraine crisis, US-China strategy contestation, India's desire to secure its rightful place in global affairs, do you see any points of convergence or cooperation between India and China? Are two countries far apart at this point of time?
Quick answer, sir. The convergence can only happen if, as you said at the beginning of this discussion, of this panel discussion, there's a certain amount of peace and tranquility on the borders and normalcy on the borders. We can't have any cooperation at this point in time, despite the flourishing trade between the two countries or students going to each other, unless the India's territorial integrity and sovereignty is maintained. Also, fundamentally, India and China come from two different schools of thought, two different cultures. One is a democratic country, another is a communist country, and so on and so forth. The divergences are great, and the collaborations or the cooperation can only happen in certain areas, whether, as we saw on environment or the other issues where you're on the same side of the divide. But with China's economic growth, and as Senior Colonel Jobo said, trying to compete with the US, pitching itself against the US, I think those areas of collaboration have also reduced over a period of time. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sushant. Finally, there's a question for General Huda from Arush Joshi. Question is whether we are in a two-front situation today.
So thank you. Let me try and answer this very sort of basically and briefly. We've always been in a two-front situation. We have a threat on our western borders from Pakistan, and we fought so many wars. There's been Kargil, infiltration is going on, and there is an unsettled border along our northern frontiers, which is where China is located. So the two-front situation has always existed. What shape and form this will take, whether both fronts will get activated together as a two-front war, it's not for me to say. But as far as the military is concerned, should it completely ignore this possibility? And the answer is no. So you have to prepare for that contingency. So I think when you're looking at this two-front and two-front war, two-front threat, you must understand that these threats and these areas have existed and will exist into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. We have many more questions in the chat box, but we have unfortunately run out of time. In fact, we have exceeded the allotted time by almost 10 minutes now. So let me conclude today's conversation by thanking 4 speakers for their excellent presentations, both their opening remarks as well as their responses to various questions which came up. I would also like to thank Ritusha for her role as a discussant and for coming up with 4 very thought-provoking questions. I've not tried to summarize the discussions we had today because we had really rich conversation this afternoon, provided many insights into a complex situation, and hopefully also came up with some good ideas on the way ahead. How do we address the present situation in border areas in the short term and in longer term? Thank you very much to all of you for joining this conversation, and we'll continue this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure to be here. Thank you.